and look back at an article that was published by the Washington Post on May 31, 1992. It was called The Last Resort, and it publicly exposed an underground classified facility in West Virginia. For over 30 years, the facility was an active, live facility with communication and all equipment updated. The bunker was kept in full operational status. The location of the facility remained a secret for over 3 decades. After the Washington Post announcement in 1995, the United States government ended the lease with the Greenbrier Hotel and declassified the facility. This facility now is available to the public, and the public can tour it. Denise and I were talking about this earlier today. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the Greenbrier? I've not been there yet, but I've always wanted to go.
Yeah, it's within the hotel, the Greenbrier Hotel, and it's got huge, heavy doors that slide open. Nobody would have known they were there until it leaked out. The whole thing was discovered and exposed. It is open for tours. I haven't seen it yet and would love to. The question that we all have is, so what now? Where do these people go? Our government, maybe other governments, NASA, all these people that need a place to go should something happen to not only the United States but the planet Earth. And we need to restart. We need to have a place to begin again, whether it be an asteroid hitting, Third World War, whatever. And we no longer have the Greenbrier. It's completely exposed. So what do we do? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I think Mike's going to discuss something that we've all listened to and we are thinking about, and we'd like to have you listen in and hear what we have been thinking about. So, Mike, if you would want to take it and discuss this gentleman, Phil Schneider, tell us a little bit about him, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, we wanted to start out with the Greenbrier tonight because it's a reality, and as we go forward this evening, both Mike and Denise, we're going to talk about some of these different things that are out on the internet and some of the research we've been able to uncover. We started with the Greenbrier because it's real. The construction was it started in 1958. It was built during the Eisenhower administration. It's 700 feet underground. It's underneath the Greenbrier Hotel. It was completed and opened in 1961. And the facility, it's open to the public. You can go and see it. You can go on the internet and look at it. There's hundreds of pictures of the inside of it. And it's like a little small community in there. During the Eisenhower era, it was built and provided. There were four entrances to the bunker from the actual grounds of the Greenbrier, and there was one that came up through the building. There's a 25-ton blast door on it. It's got decontamination chambers. There's dormitories designed to accommodate 1,100 people, a water plant with purification equipment, and 3 25,000-gallon water storage tanks. There's 1,400 gallons of diesel fuel stored underneath there, a complete communication area, including a television production studio with recording booths. There's a clinic in there, a hospital with beds for medical and dental operating rooms, laboratories, pharmacies, intensive care units, cafeterias, and they had meeting rooms set up for the entire House and Senate of the United States. So it's real. These things are out there. The Greenbrier is only a small tip of the iceberg. Back in the mid to late 90s, a gentleman named Phil Schneider came out and started talking about some of these construction projects. So if you, Mike, if you want to we talked about that earlier today. Do you want to talk a little bit about Phil and kind of just give us a general overview of what happened, what he was all about?
Certainly. And I think the significance of the intro talking about Greenbrier is that, it's important to note that when we talk about underground bases and secret government compounds. Here we have a good example of something that's real and tangible, and it's not just a rumor. So it's important, and that leads us to Phil Schneider. And who was Phil Schneider? And for the folks that have never heard that name, I suggest you really pay close attention to the discussion tonight as it relates to him. Because at the end of the day, when you make your own decision, whether or not you think his story is legitimate or partially legitimate or not, there's certainly no argument that this is very, very intriguing. And so here we go. Phil Schneider, he was basically a self-taught geologist and an explosives expert. And I will also interrupt myself and say that, in this great era of the Internet and this absolute instantaneous connection to information that we all have at our fingertips, by all means, when we're done here tonight, I certainly hope that you folks take notes, write down names, dates, really dig into this stuff, because it's at the very least it's an interesting story. Phil Schneider was a geologist who claimed to have been a contractor. He was a contractor for the United States government, and he held a level 3 top secret security clearance. And he was involved in the building of 13 of the underground bases that we're talking about. And they call these underground bases the DUMS, which stand for Deep Underground Military Base. And I think at the time there were 129 of these facilities, and he had claimed to have personally worked on 13. Now, one of the major ones was at Dulce, New Mexico, and it was there that Phil Schneider, and hang on to your hats here, but it was there that he basically maintained that gray humanoid extraterrestrials were working side by side with American technicians, and that's in the construction of these bases. And in 1979, what they call a misunderstanding occurred, and that resulted in, and we'll get into this a little bit later in more detail, but that actually resulted in a shootout between the aliens and the humans. And if Phil Schneider is to be believed, there were a number of casualties. There were 66 Secret Service, according to him, FBI, Black Berets, and unspecified number of Greys that were killed in this battle that supposedly took place underground. Now, when we talk about these DUMS, these deep underground military bases, I think it's important to pay attention to some of the facts that Phil Schneider has spoken about. Unfortunately, he is no longer with us, and I'll get into that in a second. But before he did die, he really came clean and made a number of public appearances, to get this information out, in spite of his top secret clearance that he held. And he did this as a sense of just really service to mankind, in that he formed the opinion during his tenure with as a contractor with the government, that the bases were being built for nefarious reasons, and that they certainly weren't being built to further the mankind and the comforts of mankind on Earth. So basically, he talked about 131 of these deep underground military bases, and he claimed that they were built to subvert the people, quite frankly. The government at that time, according to him, was building about 2 of these a year. And when you think about the dollars involved, the numbers he gave were $310 billion, and those are black budget dollars, which basically means that they are hidden from Congress, they're hidden from the people. And that's how the government gets things done when they want to get them done, out of sight and out of mind. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but when we talk about his beliefs on what was happening in these tunnels and what the reasons behind their construction was, it gets pretty dark. Some of the interesting things. Well, let me move on here. The average size of these bases, these underground bases, were 41 4.25 cubic miles. That was the average size of them. And they were built at a depth of about 5,700 feet. Pretty substantial by any standard. The cost of these were each $17 to $31 billion each, and they employed approximately 1,800 to 10,000 people. And again, as we dig into this conversation and this subject, I invite the listeners and the hosts to think about the ramifications of having that many people involved in something so secret. We could take that in many directions. He referred to a deep underground military base in Sweden that was approximately 30 square miles. Just unbelievable when you're thinking about the depths that we're talking about. He talked about the different civilizations that were involved with basically in contact with the United States and with not only the U.S. government but governments of the world. And he claimed that there were 9 different civilizations that had been visiting Earth, throughout history. And out of that 11, he claimed that 9 were not friendly entities, were indeed bad. 2 were benevolent. And, let's see here. We want to talk about also what happened to Phil Schneider. Phil Schneider claimed that after he began to come clean and started to make public appearances, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Richard, but I believe there were 13 attempts on his life up until the time that he
maintained that there were. Yeah, he maintained that there were 30 different times where someone tried to kill him. He actually died in January of 1996, and the reporting indicates that he was strangled by a catheter that was wrapped around his neck. And his bizarre death was basically dismissed by the authorities at that time as a suicide. And that's been extremely controversial within the community subsequent to his death.
Well, not only was that controversial, but his spouse actually claimed that after that quote-unquote suicide, that there were a number of visits from government agents that took boxes and boxes of family photographs and all kinds of documentations from his residence. I can tell you as a former law enforcement officer that just on the surface, if you look at the story of his death, I've seen an awful lot of suicides in my life, and I've seen some pretty bizarre suicides in my life. But to find a guy under these circumstances who literally, you can go on YouTube and watch this guy speak and tell you about the attempts on his life and explain why they were occurring. For him to suddenly turn up with a catheter wrapped around his neck, this is not a small guy either. This guy was a pretty formidable guy in terms of size and strength and just attitude. And it definitely doesn't pass the smell test. Certainly by any standard law enforcement suicide investigation.
And also, Mike, for a suicide, why would the FBI and CIA take 1/3 of the family photos from the home if it in fact was a suicide? What would there need be to remove that many photos? Well, and why would the CIA and FBI be involved?
Yeah, I certainly don't want to. I don't profess to be able to explain, what the protocol is of the FBI and the CIA. And again, we have to be conscious of the fact that the man claimed to hold that high-level security clearance. Now, let's assume that he did hold that kind of a clearance. It may very well be within the protocol of the federal law enforcement to make sure that if somebody with that type of clearance is deceased, that you don't leave, classified documents laying around. So I don't necessarily know that in and of itself is something that's a bad thing, but it certainly adds to the mystery. I would also add too that when you listen to Phil Schneider's story and you really dig into it and you understand it, I think you can, but it certainly adds to the mystery. I would also add too that when you listen to to Phil Schneider's story and you really dig into it and you understand it, I think you walk away with a sense that really one of two possibilities exist with the man. He is either a complete nutcase, pardon the term, or he's a very great and compassionate human being and brave beyond description for coming out and putting himself in harm's way to do as he claimed he was doing, which is to warn humanity and to give humanity a chance, and specifically America. He really came across in the speeches I heard him make as an extreme patriot, for whatever that's worth. But, you look at him, you look at his background, the things that you can verify. Now, he talked about this battle that occurred underground and in the incident, he was being lowered down into a shaft that they were digging. And I guess they had drilled into a different section underground, and they stumbled across these alien life forms or entities that were there. And, the battle erupted. He had described in detail I believe it was a 7-foot tall alien being that had some sort of a device on his chest, on the alien's chest. And when the alien reached up to activate that device, a beam, I believe they even referred to it as a beam weapon, was emitted. And Phil Schneider, you can see him like I said, you can see videos of him. He certainly had lost a number of digits on his hand, and that were clearly as a result of burns. There were many, many people that had substantiated claims that he had a horrendous scar on his midsection, which would be completely consistent with the stories that he told about this great battle. And at some point, he developed a pretty heavy-duty cancer that he attributed to his encounter with this being and his beam weapon. So, to say that it's not interesting. I couldn't say that. I tell you, the more you read about Phil Schneider, and the more you dig into it, the more intriguing it becomes. And I will say this too, that there is a very important message in all of what Phil Schneider was saying, because if a very small percentage of what he was saying turns out to be accurate and true, then we as humans, in my opinion, would be remiss not to try and make ourselves as aware as possible, because this is, we're all in this together, this thing called life, and this is important stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly true. We need to study and research, not just stop with one case, but to continue looking. I mean, this man had samples of metal and told you exactly what it was made up of, what the consistency was, where he got it from. And Richard, did you not say that all those items that he had on display were later confiscated?
Well, I think what it was is I was thinking about that when we were talking about the guys coming to his house. If you watch the videos that are on the Internet, he had made this one presentation where he had several items that he held up and described them in terms of the metallic composition, the chemical composition of the metal, if you will. And what he was alleging is that there were certain pieces of metal, and he characterized them as being currently used in the aerospace program on very high-tech aircraft, and that these metals contained elements that weren't earthly, and that the idea that he had said that, if you remember when we were in high school in chemistry and you had the chart with the elements on it, apparently there are more elements now than there were when I was in high school.
Yeah, he talked 105 elements on the periodic table that we were taught, and he claimed there were actually 140 elements on the new periodic table.
And some of the spec, is Michael alluded, this thing is a can of worms that once you start looking at it, it's got many tentacles that go out in many different directions. A lot of the things that we were seeing on here, we're talking about. The whole consensus here is that there is a culture, a military industrial culture, if you will, that's operating within our society on a totally different level, and that they have technology that's totally advanced of what is publicly introduced, and that some of the allegations made were that they've actually gone off planet and done mining, or that these entities have brought elements to this planet where they're making metal components for very high-tech aerospace projects that contain elements but aren't earthly. And he had some of those. He had 3 or 4 of those things that he displayed. And he held them up, and these are really light, and it's made out of titanium plus other things. And he obviously had some very controversial stuff that he was showing at some of these presentations, which my guess would be that probably disappeared with the family pictures.
Yeah, it sounded like it. And then he hinted at the fact that stealth technology at the time came from the back engineering of a UFO, and he had a tube that was filled with little circular or teardrop-shaped stuff that he said when some of this craft of ours came to a stop, this stuff dripped off it and hardened into the teardrop shapes, and he was given some of it. And that's all disappeared. And he said it was... Go ahead.
Another thing that I noticed about him, and I paid very close attention to this guy. Like I do anytime I'm watching somebody talk and I'm trying to judge their credibility. And I can say, and Richard, you and I talked about it a little bit tonight. When you watch the videos of him speak, there are certain subtleties that lend themselves to Phil Schneider's credibility with respect to what he claims. I think it doesn't take long to understand that the man was certainly a geologist. I don't have to have a medical background to know that if a person claims to be a doctor, within a few minutes I'm going to know just by his vernacular and the choice of words and the way he talks. I'm going to know whether or not this guy is telling the truth. And in a subject like this, I can tell you that being former military, one of the funny things that not too funny actually in terms of stolen valor, but you run into a lot of folks that during the Vietnam War, everybody was a Green Beret. Almost 99% of the folks you talk to was. I had a joke that I used to say about, if everybody in Vietnam was a Green Beret, who was cooking the food? So there were a lot of folks that were wannabe Green Berets. And in this topic and in this field of study, you certainly, on the internet, you have to swim through a sea of people that are being less than honest, being disingenuous, telling partial truths. Some may be spreading disinformation, but you tend to, if you're a good listener and you're a good observer, you tend to get a good feel for who you're listening to. And most of us can size up somebody, even if it's on a topic that maybe we're not familiar with. And this gentleman, Phil Schneider, comes across, in my opinion, somebody who has listened to an awful lot of people lie to me. He comes across as very, very believable. Certainly with respect to what his profession was and his level of expertise, his knowledge of government, just the way he talked, the terminology, government classified type operations. Those are all subtle things that when you put them all together, they make it very hard to write this man off as being some sort of a quack.
Yeah, he did sound genuine. Yeah, go ahead, Richard. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that where I wanted us to maybe take a look at next is I think that if you listen to him, he initially thought that these bases. I think most people would say that they believe that there are underground bunkers and bases. The question is how many of them are there and how big are they? And the $64,000 question is what are the purposes for them, or what are they being used for or intended to being used for? And I think that's where some of the controversy here is. This is where some of the wheels start to fall off some of these things. When these people that are working on these things start talking about that, the thing comes up about how these are boot camps or holding camps, and then they talk about these cultures that have developed where there's actually two societies, kind of living side by side with each other, or better, more like one on top of the other one. And you're looking at an extremely high-tech, compartmentalized, very secret, high-stealth, very lavishly funded operations going on down in these facilities. And not only just Phil Schneider, but I had for a few weeks I've been really getting very interested in these underground facilities and what's really going on here. And what's more important than the facility is this counterculture, this idea of these bases. They're building this base in Sweden that Mike talked about, and what are they going to do, or what is it that's going to happen that they need to get underground like this? And I think I think it's a given that some of these bases certainly exist. How deep and how many of them. I think that there's probably some speculation there. But the interesting thing is, what are they going to do with them, and why are they building so many of them, and what is what's the rush on getting all these things built so fast? When you're building these facilities, and just some of the research I did with some of the other writers, they're talking about facilities that employ anywhere from 1,800 to 10,000 people. They're building 2 of them a year. They cost, $26 billion. They're saying that half the black budget in the United States is allocated to building and maintaining these facilities, and not just the facilities of the bases, but the tunneling and they claim that they've got these tunneling machines, and there's a picture. We put one on our website, and they're talking about bases that are between like 2.6 and 4.25 cubic miles in size. That's huge. You could stick a couple of shopping centers in something like that. Big shopping centers, malls.
Well, then you also combine the information that we've got regarding the connecting tunnels with we've got the maglev monorails that reach Mach 2 traveling from East Coast to West Coast, and I think when you look at the subject of underground bases, and specifically military, you break it down. You should break it down and ask yourself, first of all, why would you put something underground? You want to put something underground to either hide it or protect it. So an underground base in and of itself, I don't necessarily is a dark, evil subject. I think, quite frankly, the military of any government would be remiss not to have underground bases. They certainly serve a legitimate tactical purpose. I think anybody would agree with that. I think where it starts to get a little bit shady and a little bit creepy is, quite frankly, is when you listen to some of the thoughts of people like Phil Schneider, and there's certainly others. He is not the only person to come forward with this type of information. But, he talks about prison camps, 39, I think he mentioned 39 prison camps that, facilities that were underground, sections of these bases that were going to be used when martial law was declared, and he had claimed that is precisely what the purpose of these many of these bases was, for a time when the government declared martial law. He also talked about he was heavily into the concepts of the New World Order, and how that the New World Order, some of the goals, of course, with the leaders of the stronger countries of the planet, would want to collapse governments one by one. And it's interesting because you look at the time that has elapsed since Phil Schneider's death, and then you look here at the recent activities in the Middle East with the almost domino-like collapsing of one government after another, and you connect that with this timeline that we've talked about before too, this acceleration in events in general, and this one government after another, and you connect that with this timeline that we've talked about before too, this acceleration in events in general, and this feeling that humanity is spiraling towards some huge event, whether real or imagined. It certainly jives with what he was saying in terms of governments wanting to do away with the country's boundaries and create this new world order. There's some very scary side topics too that talk about. What was the project? Help me out, Richard. Where they wanted to reduce the Earth's population by 4. I think it was 4 out of 5 people. There was actually a project, and I can't.
Yeah,
well,
there
there's
was
some
a
speculation
project
about that. The speculation that some of these entities would go underground, and then there would be the viruses or disasters or combination thereof that would cut down the population.
It was population control.
Well, it's population control. It's also, and again, when you talk about the darker side of the subject of underground bases, we can't forget the alleged 1954 treaty that was the Grenada Treaty, wherein the U.S. government allegedly and entered into a treaty with an alien race, and in this treaty, depending on who you listen to, and depending on what you're willing to believe, within this treaty were acceptable levels of technological trade coming from them. In other words, giving us little trinkets of technology, i.e., stealth to cell phone type technology, internet type stuff, and in trade, giving actually human beings for genetic experimentation, and even worse, some forms of almost, I think, cuisine. It's a cookbook from the Twilight Zone kind of thing. There are rumors that there are glandular secretions that human beings have and secrete that some of these particular alien races need or desire. So it gets pretty, like I said, it gets very creepy, and there's almost no end to the directions you can go. But those are certainly subjects that bear looking into. I mean, if it turned out, I guess what the listener should consider is the ramifications. What would the personal ramifications be if it was ever proven that our government or any government on this planet had actually entered into a treaty, a signed treaty with an alien race, and if it turns out that later that treaty has a direct link with the hundreds of thousands of missing human beings throughout the world. I mean, we're talking about Europe and in South America, and certainly the United States, but in some of the more third world countries, I mean, the numbers of people that turn up missing each year are phenomenal. So that that's where the subject starts to get a little bit darker than just the government keeping secrets.
It does. It gets very dark. We have to sort all of this out, and up to 15 years ago, at least 15, 20 years ago, I had taken a pet of mine to a vet who was very, very curious way back then about all of this. And we were discussing various illnesses and viruses in particular, and he studied them and researched. And he said to me at the time, he said, there are no new viruses. There will not be any new viruses. What we have is an altered state of viruses that our scientists create themselves. We are doing this, and we are going to do it, whether it's a diversionary tactic for one reason or another. What the purpose is, we don't know, but I guarantee you that a new illness or virus will not just show up out of nowhere. So anything that has happened, whether it be the AIDS virus, whether it be a new type of flu, they didn't just happen. They were created in our laboratories. Now, that's a doctor of veterinary medicine that had studied and researched and had continued to do so 20 years ago and told me that. And I forgot what brought that on, something I was talking about, and said, oh, there are these new things coming up. And he said, no, there are no new anything. It's not possible. Explained it to me at the time. So that's something else to think about.
Yeah, that's freaky.
The options, some of the viruses that have come out, the AIDS virus and the avian flu virus, that they claim are manufactured, that they didn't naturally evolve. I was just wanting to hit on something that Michael was talking about too, is the crime in all this is, initially we're saying, okay, they're building bases, and I think everybody realizes that we've got some bases. When we were growing up, we knew that the Strategic Air Command was underground in a base on the side of a mountain. So there's nothing really new and mysterious about the concept. It's just that, as this information starts coming out, that there's just so many of these things. They're all connected. It's not just the bases, but it's all the technology that's involved in this, which has an incredible era of unfairness about it. And what I mean by that is, when they talk about these bases, they've got these drilling machines that'll go through the ground, and they use nuclear reactors to generate heat. And when they, I did some research about this, and there's a couple pictures of them on our website. And these things have been developed and patented, and they can go through the ground and bore between a 30 and a 40-foot hole in the ground. And the grindings from the drilling basically are melted. The rock is melted and positioned around the walls of the tunnel, and it makes like a glass-like lining to the inside of the tunnel. And these machines can go through the ground, through rock, drill it out, melt it, and then mold it on the sides of these tunnels. And they're talking that they've got machines that can go 7 to 12 miles a day underground, completely building a 40-foot diameter tunnel with no debris. Because that would be the thing that you'd look at. If you're going through the ground like that and you're digging these vast tunnels all over the place, you'd have piles of dirt and debris somewhere to deal with it. It would show up somewhere. And it doesn't, because that's apparently how these machines work, is they make these holes through these tunnels through the ground, and when you're done, you've got this perfectly glass-lined, tunnel. And then the technology, the machines that run through them, they're talking about trains that run at Mach 2 going through these tunnels. Transportation that you could go from Washington, D.C., to San Francisco in an hour and something. So that's I think where you got to start wondering what's going on with all this technology. Throughout all this research I've done, that's the thing that keeps popping up, is the technology, all this incredibly advanced, super advanced technology that's years ahead of the public. How the military and these military contractors have this technology that's 40, 100 years ahead of what we have on the ground here. We think, oh, we're really cool. We've got our Android phones and our, the microchips in the computers, and these guys are like, well, that was just like when, we went to Africa and we're given the natives glass beads and stuff, and that's what they're doing. They're throwing us a little bit of a bone every once in a while, but they're taking that money and they're using it to develop technology that could be used for a lot of things on this planet to help a lot of people out, and it's being very stingily used and selfishly used in a way to perpetrate these little cultures. And what I think, that's the underlying thing that these guys are upset about, is it's not that it's impossible, but why are they doing it? What's going on with this technology? Why are they doing this, and where are they going with it?
Well, that's the uncomfortable connection, Richard. You hit the nail on the head, connecting the subject with some of the, I will tell you, I've spent most of my life avoiding anything that even looked like a conspiracy theory. I have a military background, law enforcement background, pretty cut and dry. Want to be a good citizen, want to trust my government. have never been comfortable thinking that there could be dark forces that are aligned against our very people, coming from our any form of leadership, whether it's covert or in plain view. That being said, I'm not a young kid anymore, and when you start to look at these things, and you talk about the unfairness is a very good word for it, and I think it even can go a little bit deeper than that, so to speak, in that, if let's assume Phil Schneider was right in terms of the purposes, the purposes that he uncovered, and that made him come public at his own peril. If there's any truth whatsoever to that, it would make absolute sense for a governing body, a government of any country, to keep the people who were ultimately, you wanted to thin out the herd anyways. You want to keep them busy and occupied, and you release a trinket here, a piece of technology there. And if you look at the state of society, of advanced society today, we all carry around our Android phones, and we all, are happy with our laptops and computers in each room, and our huge TVs and LCD this and LED that. And I'm one of them. I mean, I've got probably every trinket known to mankind. But if you keep a population, sitting at the desk, giggling and smiling at their new bright lights and not paying attention, and then for those that aren't interested, you can have a couple of wars going on simultaneously, and you can have all kinds of threats of disease and outbreaks, and pretty soon you've got the ants that are not in the ant farm running around focusing on the wrong things. And that is the scary part, because when you talk about withheld technology, not only for convenience in terms of travel, but, we've all read and heard about, water-based engines, non-fuel burning type engines, things that would put our dependence on fossil fuels and coal burning energy, just completely eradicate that. When we start to hear about those types of technology being secreted in some dark underground base because we're not capable of handling it, or there's reasons to keep that from us, man, that goes beyond being selfish. It really is evil, and I'll be the first guy in line, to be on my knees crying of a broken heart if it ever turns out that I could substantiate the fact that the very government that I have served proudly would even consider conspiring against its own people. That is the darkest scenario I can imagine.
Well, I mean, think of it. I was thinking about this a lot in the research that I had done for this, and we all did. I mean, I looked at a dozen sources. Phil was one of the last ones that I actually stumbled on. But, when they're talking about these, if you think about it from this perspective, right now we're in a country, there's a global economy that's just in terrible shape, and I've grown up. I grew up in the Northeast, and I've worked, in the big cities and the big buildings and stuff like that, and I can't tell you, how frustrating it is to sit in traffic for an hour and a half just to get to work every day, just to make enough money to pay your bills. And, if I find out, me being just Joe U.S. citizen, if I find out that they've got these underground cities and they've got rapid transit systems, the magneto-levitation trains that travel at Mach 2, and they can go not all over just the United States, but all these bases are apparently connected by these tunnels and trains, including the ones undersea, which I'm going to get to in a minute. And, I look around and you drive under half these bridges in this country, they're rusted out, they're all rickety. Look at the train tracks, even when I travel to work every day, there's the train lines that go into the city, and they're all rusted and particularly unusable. If all this money's being spent on this high technology underground, there's going to be a lot of people pretty ticked off about that when they figure out that all these years and all those tax dollars have been used against them. That's when it's going to get bad, when people find out this is really going on. And I'm not saying it is, but if it is, figure out that all these years and all those tax dollars have been used against them. You know, that's when it's going to get bad, when people find out. People find out this is really going on. And I'm not saying it is, but if it is, there's going to be a lot of unhappy campers up here. And, you know.
Absolutely. And not just with that. As far as population control, they're using or withholding advances in medication and medical supplies, medical advances to keep us from being well. I think there are stories about that also, and that's another whole show in itself. But one thing that I want to bring up here, if we have the ability to control traffic and to make things better as far as pollution, et cetera, and things that you just mentioned, Richard, then we can switch over to the medical to make us well there. I was very ill when I was younger, in my 20s, and they told me not to get sick. Well, I got the flu. I was handed a pill that took away the flu in 2 hours. And I think the only reason I got it is because my father-in-law was a well-known physician. Mm. And he was working with surgeons that had operated on me. And I think that's it. It was brought. My husband had to go to a special lab to pick it up, and the bottle was not labeled. And when I asked the doctor what was in it, what was I given, I was told, if I told you, I'd have to kill you. And that was in 1969. So I believe
this technology that we're talking about, they've been building this stuff since the 40s and 50s.
Yeah,
and,
all of this.
When we look at, one of the things that I found in the research too is they call the DUMS 2, or the underwater facilities, and apparently. That is just as well developed as the ones on the ground. And again, they talk about the moonless mountains, where these mountain ranges well under the sea, that they've been able to tunnel into them and build bases in there. And, if I think it's what Mike said, all this is so controversial, and if it wouldn't have been for the Greenbrier coming up, we'd have probably said, those things about those bases are exaggerated and stuff like that. But, I mean, if they're building this stuff now with the technology we have now, I've seen the pictures of the Greenbrier. That thing was built in 1958.
Yeah.
Right.
And let me just take it I'll take it a step further and just to add a little bit more mud to the water. Far and above just technology being kept from the masses, let's move it to the next notch. If this technology is alien in its origin, and it was acquired by way of a contract, treaty, or what have you, with an alien race, there is so much more information that goes beyond just comfort and travel and gadgets and efficient machines. What else do these alien races know about the origins of mankind, the origins of themselves? What sorts of things could come up? What sorts of information has been transpired and between the races that would rock the foundations of all of us in terms of what we have grown up believing? And I don't mean just we as Americans. I'm talking about we as humans, with all of the cultures and all of the various beliefs, be they religious or otherwise. There's you certainly you have to draw the connection between a race of extraterrestrials that was capable of coming to another planet, Earth, and handing over new technology. Those folks have to possess more than just faster cars and better burning gasoline, if you catch my drift. In other words, these people may hold answers to secrets and answers to questions that mankind has been pontificating since we stopped carrying, stone spears. And what ramifications would that knowledge have on us? And why is that? If this is to be believed, why is it that that's being kept from us? You know, I mean, I would forego the gift of technology for just a couple of answers to some well thought out questions.
Well, I think that's the whole, you know, in not just in related to this particular segment, the research, but the whole concept of ufology. And let me try to explain what I'm saying is, you know, I started out, you know, I learned how to fly 30-some years ago, and I got interested in this phenomenon probably before that. And it was pretty obvious to me early on that this stuff is probably real, and that why would the government go to such extremes to keep the UFO thing secret? Well, then, you know, as I explore it and research it, when you start to look at the concepts like Corso outlined in his book, and he's talking about the technology and how it was cultivated, and how these companies were introduced to certain types of technology, crashes in Roswell and Aztec and some of the other places, that you know, they were basically presented with deals, and it was like, you know, you can develop this, you can do the research, you do the research and development on it, you can use the patent rights for it, you can make all the money you want on it as long as you keep the technology for military industrial applications. And, you know, then later, of course, it came out and, you know, some guy totally tried to debunk Corso's book. And, you know, at the time, I came up in the financial world, and you know, I'm looking at the companies that he's talking about in his book, where they gave this, you know, like Bell Laboratories got fiber optics, and DuPont got Kelvar, and IBM got the microchips and Texas Instruments, and, you know, you look at all these companies from back in 1949 and 1950s, and all of a sudden they're the big bad, you know, ass-kicking blue-chip stock companies of the world. You know what I mean? They're the big Dow companies. You know what I mean? And so it's always been about money, and I think it's still about money. When you do this research and look at all this stuff that these guys are talking about, they're not talking, you know, we're missing the boat when we're going, oh, the government's doing this to us. The government's going to do this. The government's going to do that. Guess what, you know? The more I read this stuff, the government's out to lunch. This has all been subcontracted. This is being run by multinational corporations. It's all about money and power. And these companies, you know, are running things. And it's not the government. You can't blame the government because it's not them. You look at these multinational companies, and some of this research indicates that these companies actually have their own underground bases, and some of these bases are built and owned by big multinational companies. Well, guess what? You know, Eisenhower said, beware of the military-industrial complex. It's always resonated in my mind ever since I was a kid, you know. And he was telling you something. If he really did make deals with the aliens, and they claim he was the guy that was in the middle of all that, it certainly makes sense that this thing has gotten way out of hand. You know, people would say, well, how could they cover all this stuff up? And you look back at how this all develops. You've got Truman in office. He's the president of the United States. And we've got this war going on. And so he gets, they get this group of guys that start doing this atomic energy research, and they're going to build a bomb. Well, guess what? Until we dropped that bomb, until the United States dropped that bomb on Japan, nobody had a clue, not one clue that anything like that was underway. Nobody knew about it. It was kept so top secret that these guys that were working on it, their families and their wives didn't even know about it. Well, guess what? The atomic energy development and the atomic bomb teams that developed those things, they also developed a whole protocol for keeping something secret. And somebody said, well, if we wouldn't have dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, well, we had told everybody else about it. Well, we had told all the other countries, oh, we have this extremely powerful, unbelievably powerful weapon that we can use. No, they'd have probably kept quiet about it until they needed to use it on somebody. And, you know, it's the same thing with the UFO stuff. The same guys that built the atomic bomb were in office and control when these things start coming down in Roswell. Well, guess what? You know, they used the same methodology they did with the atomic program, and they decided to keep it quiet till they figured out what was going on. And a lot of the writers that you see out there today, they'll say that this group, this group of whoever they are that's running all this technology, they never in their wildest dreams back in the 1940s ever thought that they'd be able to keep it secret this long. You know, it's gone way beyond it. It's gone way beyond its course, and that's why all this is happening now.
Well, even when they've had leaks, I mean, if you know that same time period when you talk about, as an example, the Philadelphia experiment, and there were certainly not just the Manhattan Project, but certainly a lot of things that did leak out as a result of that type of development, weaponization of different things, and yet when they leaked out, they were almost unbelievable. And I think there was disinformation that came out on top of a leak, and pretty soon people just forgot all about it. I mean, you don't hear very many people talking about the Philadelphia experiment, for example. You don't hear that coming up very often. Yet there's a substantial amount of documentation and witness testimony that
might have happened there. Yeah.
Sure. That certainly something happened. To what I guess the question would be, to what degree? So I mean, it's almost like even when they slip up, humanity goes about its merry way and gets the next version of whatever's cool.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And then I do believe, though, they do use some diversionary tactics to send us off course when we're getting very, very close to having something factual to show everybody, to show the public. And that's part of what they use to hide the facts and to keep us from the truth. In part of what Phil said was, does the U.S. government have an earthquake device? Certainly we control the weather now to a certain degree. We've lost control of it in attempting to put snow on the slopes to make our tourist trade better for the skiers. We've lost control of that at certain points because when I lived in Denver, they overdid it and the snow fell in Denver rather than on the slopes. But as far as the earthquakes, do we have something that let's have a little diversionary tactic going here. Let's cause a quake and cause everybody to look there and talk about the quakes while something else is actually going on.
Yeah, the HARP project.
Right. For instance, or who knows what else. We just don't know. We can ask all these questions, and I think we need to begin to ask them more and more and research further and further, and to begin to listen to some of these brave people that come forward and say, I did this, and here's as much proof as I was able to bring out, and have us take a look at it.
Well, one of the things that is Mike said, after 9/11, I was personally involved. I went to work for the government in anti-terrorist activity, and I'm very proud of that time that I served. And I was in law enforcement and also in federal service. And one of the things that you see in this research is that since 9/11 happened, our whole world has changed in terms of if you think back about how things were going before that happened, we had it pretty good back then. The Clinton administration just ended, the new Bush term started, and in spite of what, and I'm not going political here at all, but the economy was really pretty good. People were doing all right. Everybody, there were jobs and everything was going good. And then this thing happens, the 9/11 thing happens, it just totally blows everybody away. Well, after 9/11 happened, a lot of things changed in our world. Our whole concept of security changed in the way that, I remember when the Patriot Act came out. And, then they had revised it, and Patriot Act 2 was enacted. And there was things in there that were, and you can read it, And I think that's part of what Denise and Mike are saying is, people need to go out and start paying attention to this stuff and start researching it. And there was things in there that were, and you can read it, I think that's part of what Denise and Mike are saying is, people need to go out and start paying attention to this stuff and start researching. Don't believe us. Don't believe a word we're telling you. Just maybe use this as a guideline. You get out on the Internet and start looking at this stuff yourself. Look these guys up. Listen to what they're saying. Look at some of this stuff about these underground bases and look at some of this stuff about this New World Order thing that seems to be getting out of control and figure it out for yourself what you really think. But, after 9/11, a lot of things changed, and we grew up, I can remember my upbringing, it was all about America and freedom and our civil rights. And even as a fairly young man, all the civil rights demonstrations that went on, and the student protests that were very much a part of my generation, and we were great believers in freedom and our personal individualism and our rights as individuals. And the Patriot Act comes along, and if you read that, most people don't even know what it says, but there's stuff in there that says that now. You can be arrested. You can be taken into custody. You can be interrogated. You do not necessarily have the right to counsel, and you can be incarcerated. And you can be incarcerated, and they don't even have to tell your family where you are, what they did with you. All they have to do is put you under the guise of terrorism. And there's laws being passed like that in this country, and it really scares me because, anything can be terrorism anymore. And even in the UFO field, or they could say, well, if something is involved and some of these investigators get in the middle of something like this, they can lock them up and put them away forever and not even tell anybody what they did with them. It's all legal now. That's not the America that we grew up in, and that's not our concepts of freedom. And I think that's the underlying stuff here. It's not. When this all comes down, it's not going to be about how many of these shelters or how many of these bomb shelters there are under the ground or how many of these bunkers there are and how many stories deep they are and how many people they have working in them. But what's going on with us? What's going on? Why are they doing this? What's going on with our civil rights? How's it going to affect us? When people start talking about martial law, that makes me really nervous. What are they going to declare martial law about? Those are the kind of questions people need to start asking.
That makes me think of some of the things that you can read and see on the Internet about false flag operations, both past and present and potentially in the future, that would be a catalyst and an excuse, a harbinger of martial law. And, they're very uncomfortable topics. And again, I'll parrot what Richard said. And, in this day of instantaneous communication, there really is no excuse for being uninformed. Ultimately, the person that's researching must make their own decisions, draw their own conclusions. But the idea is to keep an open mind, dig as deep as you're able to do it without falling victim to being so paranoid and so frustrated. I want to thank Richard for publicly stating that he felt that it wasn't the government, because I think I heard about 6 Crown Victorias in my driveway do U-turns, but then he went ahead, then he said that it was the corporations, and I think I heard a couple of Priuses pull up. So,
I think you might check your bank account's probably been erased, and
that was erased after my divorce.
Pension plan's gone, yeah. But
how many of us have our friends or acquaintances or people that we know come up to us and just make a comment saying, I can't explain this, but I feel like something's coming. I don't know if it's good or bad. I don't know what it is. I have this anticipatory feeling that I need to be ready for something. I have had that said to me so many times in the past 2 years, I can't count it anymore. How many of us have had that happen?
Yeah, I can tell you, Denise, that's a subject that comes up in my circle an awful lot, and I've developed a couple of theories. One of them, which may be partially to have some partial truth to it, is I think that in this, when you talk about I assume you're talking about this quickening, this acceleration of time,
yes.
this feeling of momentum, both physically and almost, spiritually in terms of mankind heading toward an event. I think in this day of instantaneous news, I mean, we can, literally watch helmet cam video of battles being fought overseas as they're happening, and the absolute overload of information in real time. I think that might play a part in the sense of speed, but I also see the potential for other phenomena that may play a part in it too. And and again, some of that is personal belief. Some of it has to do with the very subject that we're talking about in a roundabout way. What do underground tunnels have to do with the quickening pace of mankind per se? Well, I think when you look at the potential agendas behind the subjects that we're talking about, you can start to correlate and put together connections between, who we are as people, where we are in this particular time frame in the universe, and the connection with any other extraterrestrials and their time in the universe, how advanced they are, their interaction with us, the motives or agenda, good, bad, or otherwise, all of it coming to a crescendo. There have been certain waves in history, in human history, that we're aware of, certain changes, periods of time. I mean, when you think about the amount of time that prehistoric man roamed the earth with stone tools and weapons, thousands and thousands of years, depending on your belief. And then you look at the last 200 years in terms of technology and the exponential increase in the Industrial Revolution, all the way up to the space shuttle and the Aurora, cell phones, videos. When you look at all of that, there's all the way back to the days of Christ. I mean, that was a spiritual shift in consciousness, in universal consciousness, or at least on the planet, because the belief system changed. And then beyond that, we became very technological, which is where we're at now. And belief systems change. People tend to be sliding away from the religious, in large part, not everybody, but there is a noticeable shift as people become materialistic, and people start to lose the feeling of oneness with their fellow human. And so all of that, I think, are steps in this staircase to the future, whatever that is. And I think the higher up the staircase we go, the quicker we ascend.
Yeah, that's very, very true.
Michael, I think that's really a lot about what this is all about is, you've got, I think you've got going back to the two sides in this is you've got this one society or one group that's living, I think, on top of each other or side by side with each other. And what you have is you have one of these two societies that obviously has this incredibly advanced technology that they're not sharing with humanity in general. And there's a lot of things that could be resolved with that technology in terms of health care and, human living conditions and things like that. But the other side of it is you've got the rest of us, the ones that are I was listening to one of the researchers. I'm going to try to get a couple of these guys on the show. I really don't want to throw their names around until I talk to them. But the one guy refers to them as sheeple, is sheep people, sheeple. And basically the masses are just sitting here being led around with a big hook in their nose, and they're putting up with this. But something's happening because now the masses are starting to push back. And I think
where does that, I can tell you, Richard, where that phrase comes from, sheeple, and I don't mean to cut you off, but sheeple is an important term for those that have not heard it, because when you picture, and please don't lose your thought there, I didn't mean to cut you off, but if you picture a herd of sheep with their heads down in the dew-covered clover, life is good, the sun is shining on their backs, they're eating clover, everything's very, very good. Well, they don't tend to notice what's going on around them. They, for all they know, there's a slaughterhouse being constructed on the other side of the fence. And what Richard's referring to is that one by one, the sheep or the sheeple begin to lift their heads, and maybe one of them looks up and says, "Hey, wonder what they're building over there." You can see the connection between the tunnels and my fictitious slaughterhouse. He has to convince the other sheep. Now, when he starts talking, a lot of the sheep are going to say, you know what, it's too much. I don't want to think about it because it's uncomfortable. I'm going to keep my head down here in this dew-covered clover, and I'm just going to be happy, and I'm going to enjoy the sun. And that's a choice. It's a personal choice for that particular sheep or those sheep. But certainly, a large number of sheep are lifting their heads and looking toward that construction project on the other side of the fence and going, things aren't looking good. What are our options?
Well, where I was going with that is exactly that, and that's a great analogy. I look at it as an elevation in human consciousness, and what you said, something's going on, something's happening out there that's making people, their consciousness is going, this is all going to end up being about human consciousness. And our consciousness is going up to the next level. And what's going to happen, and a lot of that came in the idea of disclosure and how that would all affect everything. But people, when disclosure happens, it's going to open up a lot of doors on some very dark places. And what people are going to do is they're going to look around and say, wait a second, they've been lying to us about a whole bunch of stuff. What else is it they didn't tell us? And the next thing you know, all these dirty little dark secrets are going to come out, and people aren't going to be happy, and they're not going to take it easily. There could be, I personally think there's some kind of a convergence here, and the Mayans predicted by 2012, and I don't know what the metaphysical causes are, but I think that most of us can see that there's some kind of a raising of human consciousness. People are looking around, and it's not only looking at the slaughterhouse down the street or the underground base, which is something that, that's a very good analogy because the sheep are sitting there and they're eating the grass, and just like all of our, Americans, there's probably more I'm watching the football game than listening to our show right now. They'll listen to it later on the link, but hey, it's good, I got we've got a case of beer in the refrigerator, the game's on tonight, life is good, and most Americans are sitting around thinking like that, but there's a lot of us that are starting to look around and go, all those people over in Africa, there's so many of them don't have clean water to drink, and they don't have food to feed their kids. And, there's 500,000 kids over there died last year from starvation. And all of a sudden, people on this side of the world are starting to become cognizant of that. And I think that's part of how it starts, If we've got the money to build all these underground bases and submarine bases and, high-speed transit systems and spend $2.5 trillion a year on this, how come we're not using some of that to feed these people? And that's where that's where the rubber's going to meet the road on this thing.
Let me throw this out there because I think you're absolutely right. And I'm going to challenge every listener out there tonight to, clearly you're one of the sheep who has lifted your head. And I think that I challenge everyone to go ahead and send the link from tonight's show, and this is not simply to promote the show. I think it's an important discussion, and this can be your step and your part in waking up the sheep next to you. To forward this show to other people in your email list, let them listen to it because the bottom line is we have to. Depending on how grounded we are as individuals and depending on when we started to lift our heads slowly from the clover, when the rubber meets the road, not everybody, in my opinion, is going to be able to handle, and not everyone's going to be able to survive a sudden shift. If we reach a crescendo and it's 1,000 times bigger in whichever direction you want to take it than it is right now, whether it's 2012 or 2020, at that point, people have the ones that will fare the best, regardless of the circumstances, are going to be those who have considered options, considered the different scenarios, came up with game plans. Knowledge is power. That's an old saying, but it certainly rings true, and it's extraordinarily important that we stay informed, we stay in control of our emotions, we don't freak out and start, digging a bomb shelter of our own, but that we, the more of us that lift our heads up in the flock, the more powerful we are and the more influential we are. Digging a bomb shelter of our own, but that we, the more of us that lift our heads up in the flock, the more powerful we are and the more influential we are. And I don't mean that by way of, in terms of revolution by any stretch, but revolution isn't always a violent thing. It could be a knowledge revolution where it's much harder to slaughter the entire herd of sheep than it is to lead them into the gates, through the gates one at a time. Pairs of two or six.
Yeah, that's very true, and we don't even know, although some of us might have an idea of who gets chosen to go underground to those safe bases. We know our governments, we know some of the scientists, we have some ideas, but what about the rest that we might need?
Denise, that's so funny that you mentioned that. Richard, you might remember I brought that up to you a while back, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to back this up with any references, but it's certainly worth looking into. Somewhere in my vast quest for the truth, I stumbled across some articles and some internet pages that dealt with that very subject, Denise, and it's very scary when you think about it. It basically outlined a plan where there were certain groups of citizens that had possessed certain skills, carpentry skills, all the way up to and including musicians and the arts, the entertaining arts, doctors of medicine, psychologists, all of the different trade crafts that you would need to start a society or to maintain a society, and that these people had some form of ID card, some sort of thing where they would have in those days that I read about this, they would get a page, they would receive a certain number on their pager, which would mean they'd show up at a certain shuttle point and be shuttled to. I think the base I was reading about in those days was Mount Weather in Virginia, which I believe is also an underground base that was outed by way of a plane crash on the property many years ago. But that these people had a protocol, and there were selected groups of everyday average citizens who passed a certain criteria, whether it was physical strength, some sort of vocation. But that has got that creepy factor on that one is just pegged as far as I'm concerned. That's a Twilight Zone.
I can promise you that the poor, the handicapped, the underprivileged, the free-thinking individuals, none of those are going to be in there.
That's right.
It's all going to be about the affluent and the pretty people and the rich and their children. And
that sounds very familiar, doesn't it, when you think in terms of blonde hair, blue eyes, and, that's a scary.
Absolutely. And therefore, who would want to go there?
Well, boy, I'll tell you, I'd give you a round of applause. That statement right there is probably the most important. I'm with you 100% on that.
Hey, guys, I was thinking we'd take a quick break. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Tonight you've got Denise, Michael, and Richard. We're talking about underground bases and all the implications associated with that. We'll be back in about 3 minutes.
Hello, this is Richard Lang, producer of Arira Radio and agency director of Arira, which is the Aerospace Research Investigation Reporting Agency. Wanted to take just a few moments to serve up some general information about Arira Radio and how the Arira project started and evolved. The concept of Arira developed when a group of people got together, wanted to start an organization with a completely non-political agenda, and get some of the best researchers, the most highly trained investigators, and some of the most experienced scientific people to write reports and publish information about UFO cases and about anomalous phenomena related to unidentified aerial phenomena. As Arira developed, we realized that we could reach a much broader spectrum of individuals by using internet radio, and so we began to explore that and ultimately founded Arira Radio UFO Live FM. It wasn't so long ago, in 1999, when I did my first investigations, We literally typed them up on paper. The photographs were sent to the local drugstore to be developed, and then everything was put in manila envelopes and mailed off to headquarters. In such a short time, in the passing of only about a decade, information now travels at the speed of light across the internet. People are communicating more with social networks. We see the impact of that all over the world. The same kind of changes that are occurring in the geopolitical arena are also occurring in ufology. With information traveling faster, more people being able to communicate with each other all over the world, language is no longer a barrier because of the translation modes in email, and the photographs that are coming in are just astounding now, because half the population is walking around with Android phones that have high-resolution video cameras in them. So with all that said, we believe that we're kind of at a tipping point where human consciousness is going to the next level, and many of us at Arira think that we're really going to be a big part of that. So stay tuned with us. We're going to bring our guests on and share as much information as we can. We're going to do it honestly and fairly and hope it will enrich your experience. You are listening to Arira Radio UFO Live FM. Arira is supported by its members and from donations provided by the public. If you would like to support Arira Radio, go to www.arira.org and click the donate button. Your contributions will help make future shows possible. Thank you.
This is Richard Lang. We're back tonight. We've been talking with Denise Stoner and Mike Wise. We started out talking about underground bases and tunnel boring machines, and we've kind of gone a little bit out of the box and looking at why these guys are building these things and what the possible purposes for these bases are. Even more important, that this apparently unbelievable technology that's been developed and why it's not being shared with the rest of us, and that's kind of where we left off. So we're back, and let's get back to that. Talk about technology for another minute. I really think that as I keep doing this research, I've just been like fascinated about these underground bases, and my motivation is like trying to figure out what it would be like to get down there and get in one of those little subway cars and in Washington D.C. and like an hour later you're out in Colorado or Utah or San Francisco and just try to imagine what those things would be like under there. And initially, that's kind of where my curiosity was. It's just like, what's this all about? How does it work? And why are they doing it? But then it takes on a whole life of its own, and you start thinking about, why are they doing this? What's going on? What is the purpose of these bases? What are these? What's the motivation? And then you start getting into this whole thing about, the one world government. And all the kind of quasi-conspiracy stuff that's coming up about that and what's going on and catastrophes and then it almost evolves to a level where we're looking at consciousness. You've got technology underground and this whole concept of consciousness. And what that's, I really think that there's some, I don't understand it completely. I don't know what the answers are, but I know the answer has something to do with human consciousness.
Well, I would agree with you, Richard, and when we talk about technology and the fact that we're talking about specifically secret technology that is being kept from mankind, the first question that comes to my mind would be, what would be the purpose of keeping that type of technology that could benefit mankind from the masses? But then when you go back in our history, in our human history, with the advent of religion in general, and I certainly don't mean to speak out against or imply that I'm speaking out against anybody's personal belief system. However, the facts are facts, and there are certainly control factors that have been developed by way of governments, which started with religions. And, I think probably one of the biggest I don't know, maybe we don't even want to go down this road, but one of the biggest affronts to controlling populations was the invention of the printing press, because prior to that, the masses had to go to one particular spot and get their information from one particular person, whether it was a religious leader or a village leader or whatever the case may be. And on that note, I mean, there's, for example, there's an expert that claims, with respect to the secrets kept by the Vatican, comes to mind. There's an expert that claims there are 24 miles of shelves that throughout the Vatican itself that are basically material that has been kept from the masses. So when we think about what would be the reasoning behind that, that's almost the same as keeping technology from the masses, because it's information. And the mind can go in many, many directions when we try to ask ourselves, boy, wouldn't we like to rifle through a few boxes of some catacomb that, filled with secrets that were kept from mankind, be they technological secrets or spiritual information that could benefit us. I don't personally think that anyone that keeps, or any entity that keeps large amounts of information from the masses has the best interest of the masses at heart. What do you think?
Well, I think that you're right as far as the, again, not to be ripping on anybody's religion, particularly not the Catholics, but if you look at the Vatican is a huge power center, and it's a very old power center. And the Catholic Church has tentacles all over the world, they probably do have a lot of information. One of the things that, when they were talking about disclosure, in the last couple of years, one of the encouraging points that I saw was when the Vatican started talking about the reality of UFOs. Again, they sure know a hell of a lot more about it than I do. And if they're starting to come out and say, yeah, this stuff's for real, and you can't be excommunicated for, ufology and stuff like that, that's telling you that they know something's coming.
That's right.
And, research I've seen where they've got some of their senior people in Europe doing TV shows talking about and all that something's up there. The information that, this research, this underground base thing really opens up a lot of can of worms. The people out there, if you start looking into this stuff, it really takes you down some strange, I call them rabbit holes, but one of the things that pops up is about antiquities and history, and how that some of this stuff is clearly indicating that some of the history books, the things that we were taught, probably aren't quite what we were taught. There's a lot about our history as humans over the last 20,000 years that's probably known, that's not conveyed to the average person. And, you see that in, they used to talk about Egypt and the keepers of the antiquities, in the Museum of Cairo and Museum of London. And, these people in conjunction with the Vatican and some of the governments have got access to information that's not been shared. One of the things that I thought was really fascinating, it was almost like comic book stuff. But, my father was a veteran in World War II. He fought, in overseas, and he was part of the guys that liberated Holland during World War II. And he was decorated for it. And, they always talked about, the Nazis. And apparently there's stuff that I keep running into this stuff in the research that talks about things that the Nazis pilfered. The Nazis basically went through Europe and took a lot of art and different types of antiquities and things like that. And somehow some of that stuff has apparently ended up in some of these very mysteriously hidden places. There was some research that said some of it ended up at the Vatican and stuff like that. And they talk about how these Nazis had access to some of this very high technology too. And that, we think about this in terms of, it's like you said with the Android phones and things like that, but some of the research that I've looked at indicates that this technological multinational corporate, whatever the hell it is out there that's got control of all this, the technology that they're working with is 50 years ahead of us. And that some of this stuff that was found out back in World War II, apparently around that time in the 1940s, there was a lot of stuff going on that we really would probably be surprised about. You know, in my dad's generation, and you know, I mean, I grew up with my family. We were builders. We built houses up in Pittsburgh around the airport up there, and we built 100 and some houses around the airport in Pittsburgh when I was growing up as a kid. And up with my family, we were builders. We built houses up in Pittsburgh around the airport up there, and we built 100 and some houses around the airport in Pittsburgh when I was growing up as a kid. And I can remember, you know, with my dad who had been over in Europe during World War II and stuff, but what he talked about when his grandparents built a house, they used a horse and plow to dig the foundation. That's in my dad's generation life, you know, and it's like you said, you know, my father's, when he was a little boy, they dug foundations with horses and plows and shovels for houses and buildings. And now, you know, we're looking at these machines that cut through rock and with lasers, and they can go dig tunnels 12 miles a day with nuclear reactors and tunnels. Man, that's not a that's a short period of time for a lot of technology to develop. And some of this stuff that this research indicates that, you know, these ancient societies had things that probably haven't been very well, you know, shared with us, and you know, that what is underneath those pyramids in Egypt, in Giza. You know, what really was that all about? What things have they found there that they haven't told us? You know, those are all those questions that really interesting stuff.
Yeah, why were they not preserved? Why were they lost? And now we're losing, due to the war, a lot of the things that have been taken back as far as pieces that belong in the museums in Egypt. They're now being destroyed, and we may never know what they're all about and what the truth is regarding those artifacts. Finally, I can't remember the scientist's name. You see him on TV a lot, who was calling for missing parts and pieces that were in museums in London and New York City, and he was making deals to get them back, putting the pieces back together, and now they're being destroyed, which is a shame. But now we take a look at, let's say, the Coral Castle here in Florida. We don't know how that was built. They think it was similar to how the pyramids were put together. That was hidden by that one man. And why did he do that? It was built all at night using one piece of equipment, but they have no clue how he got those giant pieces of coral put together to build that for a wife that he never really had a relationship with. But that massive building is still there. The doorway that swung on a pivot that is now broken, and they can't figure out how to repair it. That was all hidden from us. Where did he come from? And what was he attempting to show us?
One of the things that I read in some of the research with some of these other guys that have written books about it is that they claim that some of these people running these tunnel machines, when they were boring these tunnels for these underground bases, had gone through existing tunnels. They'd actually accidentally hit a vein in there, and what they ended up in was they ended up in a tunnel that they estimated was built maybe 12,000 years ago from another time in another society. And I thought that was really creepy. You know, there was some fairly serious documentation that that's happened before.
Yeah, I think. I think really, you know, that sort of opens the door to the possibility, or if you believe as I do, the probability that there have been a number of different civilizations, human civilizations, that have come and gone, and that I think at the end of the day, when if this full disclosure ever occurs in our lifetimes, I think we will, some of us won't be shocked to find out that the the ages of things like the pyramids are certainly much older than we believe, and that the existence of the Atlanteans and Richard, I mentioned to you earlier about the battery that I remember long ago reading about a battery that was found in where present-day Iraq is, and that was predated the Sumerian societies, and I believe when they added water to it or added lime or however a battery works, it actually started putting out, measurable amounts of electricity. So, and then in terms of seeking artifacts, I mean, we're unfortunately our civilization seems to really be centered on warfare and always has, which has been a real mystery to me that we haven't evolved out of that yet. But it seems like in times of war, the leadership of warriors per se tends to always want to garnish and gather certain things. Hitler, of course, one of his well-known items that he was in search of was the Holy Lance, the sword that was supposedly used to pierce the side of Christ as he hung on the cross. That was something that he believed would bring the Nazis great power in terms of victory for the war. There's been talk of stargates in more modern times that exist in places. There supposedly is one in Iraq, and that is, some folks believe, was one of the motivations for going into Iraq. There is supposedly a stargate in Iran, and you'd have to be sound asleep not to know that the situation is certainly heating up with Iran. So there's all kinds of possibilities, and again, though, they're all dark and secret, and of course the sheep just keep on nibbling, and they're not going to tell us, that's for sure.
Yeah, things that we need to have some, larger groups of people awaken and help us to discover what's going on, ask some more questions, and I think the more you come out, the more you question, the more people that are standing together, the less harm will come to folks, if in fact that's what's happened to people like Phil and others that they claim are suicides or illnesses, and when in fact it's a possibility that's not what has happened to these individuals.
Maybe there are some Phil Schneiders out there listening to us tonight. Or maybe somebody will forward this show to somebody who actually it finds its way to somebody who has some deep-seated knowledge and personal first-hand experience with some of the subjects that we're talking about. And I would humbly request anybody that possesses that type of knowledge to really give some deep consideration to perhaps coming forward in a way that is meets your comfort zone. I wouldn't ask anybody to risk their own safety or to violate any type of trust that they've entered into with be it with the federal government or anybody else. But I would certainly hope that if there are other like-minded folks such as Phil Schneider types that have access to the details of the subjects that we're bringing up, to really do some soul searching and ask yourself if you have all of the pieces of the puzzle. Are you aware of what it is you're working toward, and is it for the good of mankind or is it to subvert mankind? And I would certainly hope that you would definitely consider spreading that information, because as Denise says, the more people are aware, the less danger exists for the group.
Yeah,
well, the other thing
if
too is that.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing too is if, and again, we have to apologize. We have a little time lag here, so we keep stepping on each other. But someday we're going to figure out how to resolve that. But when you look at things that are developing in the world right now, I was always a really big fan of the disclosure concept, and we always said it was all going to be about human consciousness, and part of human consciousness is like the internet is a big factor in that. And as the Internet continues to develop and people get more, it's not that the Internet's developing anymore. I think it's pretty well developed, but people are starting to use it more. I mean, with the Android phones and everything that's going on, everything you do, you could do it on the Internet. If you want to know something, you can just type a question into Google and it'll bring you up a dozen answers. It's amazing. If you've got a 1987 Singer sewing machine and you need to know how to put the needle in it, you can type in, how do you put the needle in the Singer machine, blah, 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 and it'll come up and somebody will be out there with an answer. There'll be an answer there. It's amazing. And people are just starting to use it so much more. The other thing is all the stuff that's happening, like in the Middle East with these governments. It started in Egypt. And these kids are out there with their cell phones and they're texting each other on Facebook and social media. This social media stuff has opened up all these doors that increase human communication, which ultimately leads to an increase in human consciousness. People study this stuff, and the more you study it, the more you focus on it, the more your mind focuses on it, more your own consciousness, for whatever that means, it starts to develop, and you start to think about that, meditate about things like that more. And then look at the other side of the economy. The economy is a powder keg right now. That's kind of my area of expertise, in the real world. I always worked in the financial sector and banks and investment areas, and it's just an absolute meltdown right now. And it's not going to, I still think that we're not done yet as far as the economy goes. And it's not just here, it's globally. And so you've got all these economic crises in play. You've got instability in the geopolitical arena, the economic crisis, and then you've got this elevation in human consciousness. It's all happening simultaneously, and it's not an accident.
No, I don't believe it is, and there's something to people that are able to meditate, or if you want to call it a prayer, and there is something to the fact that they have now discovered that there is a vibrational level that can actually be sensed or felt by human beings that is a positive factor. And a lot of people that are intuitive or sensitive to that vibration and feel the positiveness about that, those are the people that are coming forward and saying, I sense something coming. How do I prepare for it? What do I do? I don't know what to expect.
Yeah, I think that's part of what you were saying, Michael, about the sheep. And you're challenged for people to start doing this research. That's, I think, part of it because, they say the true judge of anything is how you feel inside yourself. How does it affect your heart? If you read something, you're thinking, oh, this is trash, it's offensive, it's crap, I don't want to read it. But some of these things, when you read it, it almost speaks to you. And if it fits really good, if it feels good when you read it, and you look at some of this research and you're like, there's something very elemental about this that rings true with me, then you're probably on the right track. And that's the kind of thing you need to do is explore some of this stuff. Is go do the research, read the articles, listen to some of these guys on the radio when they're telling you about, this new world order and what's coming and what's happening. If it rings true with you and it gives you a certain sense of peace and it fits with your innermost thinking, it's probably got some kind of reality for you. And I think that's the whole secret is people need to start looking at people just need to start digging into this stuff and looking at it.
Well,
and it's like the sheep. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'll venture down a path here, and if you just promise not to lose all respect for me, and I'll say that in the great scheme of things, I don't necessarily, let me put it that way, look at the changes that we're talking about and the potential directions we're going as a negative. And I don't look at them as a negative because when you have to admit these are exciting times to be alive. I mean, because one thing,
I agree.
We may not know where we're going to be in a year as a society or as a people. There may be nervous feelings as to where this is all going to end. But one thing's for certain here, is that we live in a fantastic time, because even if it's cataclysmic in its end, what a great time to be alive. I mean, this is certainly not the mundane times of the 1800s when the biggest concern you had was, whether or not you were going to be able to get your herd to market. Not that there's anything wrong with cowboys and the cattle industry, but you get my point, hopefully. Certainly we can all agree that there must be more to life than being born, getting an education, choosing a career path, working toward retirement, and then killing dead of heart failure out in the front yard trying to start a lawnmower 2 years after you retire. There's certainly much more to the mission of humanity, and I believe that we are at a point in our lives where we are literally on the precipice. Much more to the mission of humanity, and I believe that we are at a point in our lives where we are literally on the precipice of something extraordinarily beautiful or extraordinarily destructive. But either way, I wouldn't miss it for the world, and I really am excited that I'm alive during this time in history.
One of the things that I can cap on that is say it's extraordinarily important to whatever it's going to be. It's really important right now.
I have to agree.
Yeah. One thing's for sure. I mean, we can't maintain the status quo from a financial perspective. Richard just outlined, our situation in terms of the economy, our political situation. Let's face it. I mean, there are more issues in the U.S. alone in terms of, race relations. Here I thought that at this age of my life that everybody would see each other as human beings or as Americans, and yet we seem to have gone backwards on many different issues. So we have racial tension, we've got political tension, we are overextended in our military missions. We've got a real threat, poised against the United States and the West. People are dying every day in just violent ways. Men killing men. Unbelievable flying machines that are raining down death on people. Poverty. All the things that we would have thought would have been tackled by the time we reach this point in our life. Here we are. So we cannot maintain the status quo. Something's got to give. And I think it's already started. I think it's tipping already. And I think the only question is not one question, it's many questions. But of course the main question is, where will we be when we get to where we're going?
That's true, and we need to choose very carefully, and we need to do our studying and our research, and we need to be ready to make this decision for ourselves. And I think, as Richard said, we need to attempt to try and get some of these people on the air with us and to make them available for our listeners to hear for themselves what they have to say. That should be one of our goals in the near future. See who we can guest appear on our radio show, because it'll be really important, I think, coming up in the very, very near future.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna reach out to some of these guys that have written some of the books about the underground bases, and maybe even get this. Anytime that you start to look at this research, it's kind of funny. It's like when you go out and start doing UFO research, and you think you're going to do the nuts and bolts stuff and take pictures, and and then the next thing you're talking to the abductees. And I think this is going down the same path. You start out, well, what's going on with these underground bases, and then, well, wow, there's a lot of them. What are they doing? Why are they building them? And then when you find out, I think a lot of these guys that have come forward, they're basically in conflict with maybe even their national security agreements, is that they're saying, hey, wait a minute, I got into this thinking I was doing my duty as a U.S. citizen, help my country, defend my country, blah, blah, blah. And then they find out these guys are building these things for applications of martial law and for corporate entities to hide in and all kinds of unbelievable dark things that you couldn't even imagine that would be really going on, and these guys are like, wait a minute, we got to tell people what's, this isn't right. We've got to, let people know. And it's clear that whatever's going on, there's a lot of, there's a lot of secrecy that surrounds the whole UFO technology thing. We have talked so openly and so often about entities and aliens on here. And I think most of us think, that we pretty much know that there's a lot of this stuff going on. But honestly, I could go to the local, one of these local meetings here, business meetings or something like that, and there are people there that would absolutely think you're out of your mind if you actually believed that there was really an alien on this planet. And that's how sheltered they are and unaware of it. And if this stuff comes out, it's a double-edged sword, because a lot of these people are going to totally freak out when they find out this stuff's all true and real. There's a lot of people that aren't going to be able to handle it. Everybody says that, I once said my prayer was to learn what was really going on with the UFO thing, and then, I think you get to a point where sometimes when you find out, you might wish you didn't know it all, It might be bad enough that you really, you might have wished you didn't know it, but it's going to affect a lot of people very, very strangely. But I still believe that it's coming soon.
Yeah, it's true, and I think using the sheep as an example, well, we've got some folks out there that actually have their heads in the sand, and they're not just nibbling on clover. They're buried deep, and it's going to be a terrific shock to them.
But I loved your example with the sheeple. The sheep, they're just nibbling on and they're building a slaughterhouse next door, and they just don't have
Oh, yeah.
Well, I want you to know that that was something that I actually created on the spot. So feel free to take it, work with it a little bit, and change it. But that's my little gift.
Yeah, well, that worked. I like that. That's the truth.
I also want to say, too, though, Richard, that what you say is true in terms of people that are in denial. But I think the other side of that coin is that for many, many reasons, we can go all the way back to the different movies that have been released, and, there's all kinds of thought processes as to why that is and who's behind that. But I think the desensitization of the public, not just the American public, but the world population with UFOs really is has a direct tie right back to the internet that you were speaking about. All of us, for the most part, have seen UFOs or purported UFO videos on YouTube. There's a never-ending amount of videos that you can see. There's instant communication, and I think that the person, if you went into that business meeting and you said, by a show of hands, how many people believe that there have been extraterrestrials visiting the Earth, I think the majority would raise their hands, as opposed to, let's say, 20 years ago when you might have been escorted out of the auditorium.
No, absolutely. There's definitely, in the last few months, or the last few years, I've noticed a big dramatic difference in, I was going to try to find it, but I can't. I have a survey from AOL, and it was done last year. And about 80% of the people in the United States, it was like 86%, I think, said that, the question was, do you believe extraterrestrials come here from other planets? And they said, like 86% said yes. And then the next question was, do you believe the United States government knows about this and hides it? And they all said, 86% said yes again. So, surely 3/4 of the people in this country have a pretty good inkling that there's something going on here with that. And I don't know how surprised they'd be. I think some of the weirdness and the interdimensional aspects of it, and that not only that where are they, the from where, but from when, where have they come from, and not only just in different places, but in different time dimensions. Those are the kind of things that some people are going to have trouble dealing with.
And there'll be percentage of folks that you could literally show them a high-definition video of a close encounter of the third kind taking place on the proverbial White House lawn, and because of their fundamental belief system, them that are just unmovable would absolutely never be able to believe it. They just couldn't believe it because they would not be capable of believing it. There are certain people that are not ready for that type of information.
Yeah.
That's true. They're coping mechanisms that it won't allow them to go past a certain point and beyond the ability to, come out of their black and white boxes and say, yeah, maybe. They just can't do it.
I'm going to take a quick break. We'll be back in like a minute and a half.
You are listening to Aurora Radio UFO Live FM. Aurora is supported by its members and from donations provided by the public. If you would like to support Aurora Radio, go to www.arira.org and click the donate button. Your contributions will help make future shows possible. Thank you.
Going live. This is Richard Lang tonight with Denise Stoner and Mike Wise. We're going to wrap it up for the evening. We're down to our last 2 minutes. We'd, as indicated, encouraged as many people that anybody that might want to send this show to someone, you can send a link to them, or you can go to our website and direct them to our website, and they can listen to the show. And also, we certainly appreciate any comments that are sent. You can email them. My email address is right on the web. It's rrlang@arira.org. And any feedback, any comments you have, certainly appreciate that. Keep us in mind as far as donations. The donations help us keep this going. Next week, the next couple of weeks, we've been talking to, I talked to Chuck Maudlin. He and I are going to talk about some, the New York. We had a case up in New York a couple of years ago, extremely good case that had incredible physical evidence. Talk about that. Also, as Denise indicated, I guess we're going to try to get some of these guys that wrote some of these other books about the underground bases and the New World Order back in the next few weeks. We're working on that. One thing that Denise and I thought was kind of funny, after we had done the show about the airport in Colorado, somebody had emailed me, and if you all remember that so many of us saw a movie back in I think it was right around 1980. It was called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And so many of us saw that movie and were just so impressed with it. One of the things that I had done recently is looked at that movie just here in the last few months, and I'm amazed at how much of the information in that movie's turned out to actually be accurate. But one of the things that somebody had said was during the movie there's this scene where there's a guy and they're looking at this data that's coming in from the tones, and the guy goes, he's a cryptographer, and he's looking at this, and he goes, I used to be a map maker. I used to be a cryptographer before I worked for the agency, and he goes, these are GPS coordinates. And, of course, the GPS coordinates is where they ultimately went to Devil's Mountain where the landing took place. Well, somebody had told me that to look those coordinates up, and we just thought that was just unbelievably interesting, that if you look at those GPS coordinates that are on the Close Encounter of the Third Kind, if you freeze frame it and copy them, unbelievably, they're the coordinates of right at Denver International Airport. So I'll leave you with that tonight, and we'll talk to you all next week. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Denise. Good night to both of you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
You are listening to Aurora Radio UFO Live FM.
And look back at an article that was published by the Washington Post on May 31, 1992. It was called The Last Resort, and it publicly exposed an underground classified facility in West Virginia. For over 30 years, the facility was an active, live facility with communication and all equipment updated. The bunker was kept in full operational status. The location of the facility remained a secret for over 3 decades. After the Washington Post announcement in 1995, the United States government ended the lease with the Greenbrier Hotel and declassified the facility. This facility now is available to the public, and the public can tour it. Denise and I were talking about this earlier today. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the Greenbrier? I've not been there yet, but I've always wanted to go.
Yeah, it's within the hotel, the Greenbrier Hotel, and it's got huge, heavy doors that slide open. Nobody would have known they were there until it leaked out. The whole thing was discovered and exposed. It is open for tours. I haven't seen it yet and would love to. The question that we all have is, so what now? Where do these people go? Our government, maybe other governments, NASA, all these people that need a place to go should something happen to not only the United States but the planet Earth. And we need to restart. We need to have a place to begin again, whether it be an asteroid hitting, Third World War, whatever. And we no longer have the Greenbrier. It's completely exposed. So what do we do? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I think Mike's going to discuss something that we've all listened to and we are thinking about, and we'd like to have you listen in and hear what we have been thinking about. So, Mike, if you would want to take it and discuss this gentleman, Phil Schneider, tell us a little bit about him, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, we wanted to start out with the Greenbrier tonight because it's a reality, and as we go forward this evening, both Mike and Denise, we're going to talk about some of these different things that are out on the internet and some of the research we've been able to uncover. We started with the Greenbrier because it's real. The construction was it started in 1958. It was built during the Eisenhower administration. It's 700 feet underground. It's underneath the Greenbrier Hotel. It was completed and opened in 1961. And the facility, it's open to the public. You can go and see it. You can go on the internet and look at it. There's hundreds of pictures of the inside of it. And it's like a little small community in there. During the Eisenhower era, it was built and provided. There were four entrances to the bunker from the actual grounds of the Greenbrier, and there was one that came up through the building. There's a 25-ton blast door on it. It's got decontamination chambers. There's dormitories designed to accommodate 1,100 people, a water plant with purification equipment, and 3 25,000-gallon water storage tanks. There's 1,400 gallons of diesel fuel stored underneath there, a complete communication area, including a television production studio with recording booths. There's a clinic in there, a hospital with beds for medical and dental operating rooms, laboratories, pharmacies, intensive care units, cafeterias, and they had meeting rooms set up for the entire House and Senate of the United States. So it's real. These things are out there. The Greenbrier is only a small tip of the iceberg
to mankind, in that he formed the opinion during his tenure with as a contractor with the government that the bases were being built for nefarious reasons, and that they certainly weren't being built to further the mankind and the comforts of mankind on Earth. So basically, he talked about 131 of these deep underground military bases, and he claimed that they were built to subvert the people, quite frankly. The government at that time, according to him, was building about 2 of these a year. And when you think about the dollars involved, the numbers he gave were $310 billion, and those are black budget dollars, which basically means that they are hidden from Congress, they're hidden from the people. And that's how the government gets things done when they want to get them done, out of sight and out of mind. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but when we talk about his beliefs on what was happening in these tunnels and what the reasons behind their construction was, it gets pretty dark. some of the interesting things, well, let me move on here. The average size of these bases, these underground bases, were 4.25 cubic miles. That was the average size of them. And they were built at a depth of about 5,700 feet. Pretty substantial by any standard. The cost of these were each $17 to $31 billion each, and they employed approximately 1,800 to 10,000 people. And again, as we dig into this conversation and this subject, I invite the listeners and the hosts to think about the ramifications of having that many people involved in something so secret. We could take that in many directions. He referred to a deep underground military base in Sweden that was approximately 30 square miles. Just unbelievable when you're thinking about the depths that we're talking about. He talked about the different civilizations that were involved basically in contact with the United States and with not only the U.S. government but governments of the world. And he claimed that there were 9 different civilizations that had been visiting Earth, throughout history. And out of that 11, he claimed that 9 were not friendly entities, were indeed bad. 2 were benevolent. And, well, let's see here. We want to talk about also what happened to Phil Schneider. Phil Schneider claimed that after he began to come clean and started to make public appearances, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Richard, but I believe there were 13 attempts on his life up until the time that he
maintained that there were. Yeah, he maintained that there were 30 different times where someone tried to kill him. He actually died in January of 1996, and the reporting indicates that he was strangled by a catheter that was wrapped around his neck. And his bizarre death was basically dismissed by the authorities at that time as a suicide. And that's been extremely controversial within the community subsequent to his death.
Well, not only was that controversial, but his spouse actually claimed that after that quote-unquote suicide, that there were a number of visits from government agents that took boxes and boxes of family photographs and all kinds of documentations from his residence. I can tell you as a former law enforcement officer that to say that it's not interesting, I couldn't say that. I tell you, the more you read about Phil Schneider and the more you dig into it, the more intriguing it becomes. And I will say this too, that there is a very important message in all of what Phil Schneider was saying, because if a very small percentage of what he was saying turns out to be accurate and true, then we as humans, in my opinion, would be remiss not to try and make ourselves as aware as possible, because this is, we're all in this together, this thing called life, and this is important stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly true. We need to study and research, not just stop with one case, but to continue looking. I mean, this man had samples of metal and told you exactly what it was made up of, what the consistency was, where he got it from. And, Richard, did you not say that all those items that he had on display were later confiscated?
Well, I think what it was is I was thinking about that when we were talking about the guys coming to his house. If you watch the videos that are on the Internet, he had made this one presentation where he had several items that he held up and described them in terms of the metallic composition, the chemical composition of the metal, if you will. And what he was alleging is that there were certain pieces of metal, and he characterized them as being currently used in the aerospace program on very high-tech aircraft, and that these metals contained elements that weren't earthly, and that the idea that he had said that, if you remember when we were in high school in chemistry and you had the chart with the elements on it, apparently there are more elements now than there were when I was in high school.
Yeah, he talked 105 elements on the periodic table that we were taught, and he claimed there were actually 140 elements on the new periodic table.
And some of the spec, Michael alluded, this thing is a can of worms that once you start looking in it, it's got many tentacles that go out in many different directions. A lot of the things that we were seeing on here, we're talking about. The whole consensus here is that there is a culture, a military-industrial culture, if you will, that's operating within our society on a totally different level, and that they have technology that's totally advanced of what is publicly introduced, and that some of the allegations made were that they've actually gone off planet and done mining, or that these entities have brought elements to this planet where they're making metal components for very high-tech aerospace projects that contain elements that aren't earthly. And he had some of those. He had 3 or 4 of those things that he displayed. He held them up, and these are really light, and it's made out of titanium plus other things. And he obviously had some very controversial stuff that he was showing at some of these presentations, which my guess would be that probably disappeared with the family pictures.
Yeah, it sounded like it. And then he hinted at the fact that stealth technology at the time came from the back engineering of a UFO, and he had a tube that was filled with little circular or teardrop-shaped stuff.
Back in the mid to late 90s, a gentleman named Phil Schneider came out and started talking about some of these construction projects. So if you, Mike, if you want to we talked about that earlier today. Do you want to talk a little bit about Phil and kind of just give us a general overview of what happened, what he was all about?
Certainly. And I think the significance of the intro talking about Greenbrier is that, it's important to note that when we talk about underground bases and, secret government compounds, here we have a good example of something that's real and tangible, and it's, not just a rumor. So it's important, and that leads us to Phil Schneider. And who was Phil Schneider? And for the folks that have never heard that name, I suggest you really pay close attention to the discussion tonight as it relates to him, because at the end of the day, when you make your own decision, whether or not you think his story is legitimate or partially legitimate or not, there's certainly no argument that this is very, very intriguing. And so here we go. Phil Schneider, he was basically a self-taught geologist and an explosives expert. And I will also interrupt myself and say that, in this great era of the Internet and this absolute instantaneous connection to information that we all have at our fingertips, by all means, when we're done here tonight, I certainly hope that you folks take notes, write down names, dates, really dig into this stuff, because it's at the very least, it's an interesting story. Phil Schneider was a geologist who claimed to have been a contractor. He was a contractor for the United States government, and he held a level 3 top secret security clearance. And he was involved in the building of 13 of the underground bases that we're talking about. And they call these underground bases the DUMS, which stand for Deep Underground Military Base. And I think at the time there were 129 of these facilities, and he had claimed to have personally worked on 13. Now, one of the major ones was at Dulce, New Mexico, and it was there that that Phil Schneider, and hang on to your hats here, but it was there that he basically maintained that gray humanoid extraterrestrials were working side by side with American technicians, and that's in the construction of these bases. And in 1979, what they call a misunderstanding occurred, and that resulted in, and we'll get into this a little bit later in more detail, but that actually resulted in a shootout between the aliens and the humans. And if Phil Schneider is to be believed, there were a number of casualties. There were 66 Secret Service, according to him, FBI, Black Berets, and unspecified number of Greys that were killed in this battle that supposedly took place underground. Now, when we talk about these DUMBs, these deep underground military bases, I think it's important to pay attention to some of the facts that Phil Schneider has spoken about. Unfortunately, he is no longer with us, and I'll get into that in a second. But before he did die, he really came clean and made a number of public appearances, to get this information out, in spite of his top secret clearance that he held. And he did this as a sense of just really service to just on the surface. If you look at the story of his death, I've seen an awful lot of suicides in my life, and I've seen some pretty bizarre suicides in my life. But to find a guy under these circumstances who literally, I mean, you can go on YouTube and watch this guy speak and tell you about the attempts on his life and explain why they were occurring. For him to suddenly turn up with a catheter wrapped around his neck, this is not a small guy either. This guy was a pretty formidable guy in terms of size and strength and just attitude. And it definitely doesn't pass the smell test. Certainly by any standard law enforcement suicide investigation.
And also, Mike, for a suicide, why would the FBI and CIA take 1/3 of the family photos from the home if it in fact was a suicide? What would their need be to remove that many photos? Well, and why would the CIA and FBI be involved?
Yeah, I certainly don't want to. I don't profess to be able to explain, what the protocol is of the FBI and the CIA. And again, we have to be conscious of the fact that the man claimed to hold that high-level security clearance. Now, let's assume that he did hold that kind of a clearance. It may very well be within the protocol of the federal law enforcement to make sure that if somebody with that type of clearance is deceased, that you don't leave, classified documents laying around. So I don't necessarily know that in and of itself is something that's a bad thing, but it certainly adds to the mystery. I would also add too that when you listen to Phil Schneider's story and you really dig into it and you understand it, I think you thing, but it certainly adds to the mystery. I would also add too that when you listen to Phil Schneider's story and you really dig into it and you understand it, I think you walk away with a sense that really one of two possibilities exist with the man. He is either a complete nutcase, pardon the term, or he's a very great and compassionate human being and brave beyond description for coming out and putting himself in harm's way to do as he claimed he was doing, which is to warn humanity and to give humanity a chance, and specifically America. He really came across in the speeches I heard him make as an extreme patriot, for whatever that's worth. But, you look at him, you look at his background, the things that you can verify. Now, he talked about this battle that occurred underground and in the incident, he was being lowered down into a shaft that they were digging, and I guess they had drilled into a different section underground, and they stumbled across these alien life forms or entities that were there, and, the battle erupted. He had described in detail I believe it was a 7-foot tall alien being that had some sort of a device on his chest, on the alien's chest, and when the alien reached up to activate that device, a beam, I believe they even referred to it as a beam weapon, was emitted, and Phil Schneider, you can see him like I said, you can see videos of him. He certainly had lost a number of digits on his hand, and that were clearly as a result of burns. There were many people that had substantiated claims that he had a horrendous scar on his midsection, which would be completely consistent with the stories that he told about this great battle. And at some point he developed a pretty heavy-duty cancer that he attributed to his encounter with this being and his beam weapon. So just